January 17, 1943. Rabble Airfield, New Britain. The sun rises over the volcanic ridges like molten copper poured across the Pacific horizon. In the pre-dawn darkness, Lieutenant Commander Hiroyoshi Nishizawa walks the perimeter of his Zero fighter, running calloused fingers along the aluminium skin, still cool from the equatorial night. The air smells of aviation fuel, salt spray, and the sweet rot of jungle vegetation pressing against the cleared earth. His boots crunch on coral gravel as mechanics in oil-stained coveralls prepare 17 other Zeros for the morning sortie. Somewhere in the distance, a parrot's shriek cuts through the rumble of warming engines. Nishizawa has 43 confirmed kills painted beneath his cockpit. 43 American aircraft that fell burning into the sea or spun trailing smoke into the jungle canopy. He is 23 years old. He believes in the Emperor, in the superiority of Japanese training, in the mathematical inevitability of victory through skill and sacrifice. In 4 hours, he will return to this same airfield and begin to understand that mathematics has betrayed him. The sound that troubles him most is not the gunfire or the explosions. It is the radio chatter. American voices, casual and numerous, filling the frequencies like static. Where yesterday there were 6 Wildcats, today there are 12. Where last week a single squadron of Airacobras defended the convoy routes, this morning the radar operators count 37 contacts inbound from Guadalcanal. Nishizawa stands beside his aircraft and performs the calculation that every Japanese ace has begun performing in the cold mathematics of survival. He has destroyed 43 American fighters. The Americans have sent him 430 more. The war began with certainty. When Japanese Navy pilots lifted from the carrier decks north of Oahu on December 7, 1941, they carried with them not just bombs and torpedoes, but the accumulated confidence of a martial tradition refined over centuries. The Zero fighter that bore them into battle represented the cutting edge of Japanese aeronautical engineering, a machine so advanced that American intelligence officers initially refused to believe the performance reports filtering back from China. With a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 33,000 feet, and a range that allowed it to escort bombers across distances American designers considered impossible, the Mitsubishi A6M0 embodied the philosophy that had driven Japanese military doctrine since the Meiji Restoration. Technical excellence married to spiritual purity would overcome material disadvantage. The men who flew these machines were selected through a process so rigorous that fewer than 1 in 10 applicants survived the initial screening. Those who endured spent 3 years in training programs that made American flight schools look like weekend aviation clubs. They practiced aerobatics until they could perform loops and rolls blindfolded, until the aircraft became an extension of their own bodies, until they could identify the make and model of an enemy plane from a silhouette glimpsed for half a second through cloud cover. They studied the tea ceremony and calligraphy not as affectations but as disciplines that taught the same perfection of form they applied to deflection shooting and energy management in combat. By the time they reached operational squadrons, Japanese Navy pilots averaged between 300 and 500 hours of flight time. Their American counterparts, in those early months, often deployed with less than 200. The results validated every assumption. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese aviators achieved kill ratios that military historians still study with a mixture of awe and horror. Over the Philippines, over Java, over Burma and New Guinea, Zeros carved through Allied air defenses like samurai swords through bamboo. At the Battle of the Java Sea, Japanese naval pilots sank 5 Allied warships while losing just 3 aircraft. In the skies above Rangoon, a single squadron of Zeros shot down 23 RAF Hurricanes in 3 days of combat. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, already an ace by the time the war was 2 months old, described the early victories in his memoir with the detached precision of a craftsman discussing his work. The American pilots were brave but clumsy. They flew their aircraft like trucks. We flew ours like birds. But beneath the victories, a different calculation was taking shape. A calculation not of skill, but of production, of factories and foundries, and the industrial capacity of a nation that Japanese planners had consistently, catastrophically underestimated. The first hints came not from combat reports, but from intelligence assessments. In March 1942, Japanese Navy analysts reviewing reconnaissance photographs of American West Coast facilities noted something peculiar in the images of San Diego and Long Beach. New factory buildings had appeared where none existed in the previous month's imagery. Hundreds of them. Vast rectangular structures with saw-toothed roofs designed to maximize natural light for assembly work. The analysts calculated floor space and made estimates based on known American production methods. They concluded that American industry could probably manufacture between 300 and 400 new fight aircraft per month once these facilities reached full production. The estimates were forwarded to Combined Fleet Headquarters and filed among other intelligence summaries. The actual number was closer to 3,000. The Boeing factory in Seattle, that had employed 4,000 workers in 1940, expanded to 45,000 by 1942. North American Aviation's Inglewood plant produced one P-51 Mustang every hour by the war's middle years. Grumman's Bethpage facility operated on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, turning out Wildcats and Hellcats in numbers that Japanese intelligence officers would have dismissed as enemy propaganda if they had encountered them in captured documents. The Willow Run bomber plant outside Detroit, a single facility designed by Albert Kahn and financed by Ford Motor Company, covered 67 acres under one roof and produced a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. The mathematics of this production was alien to Japanese industrial philosophy, where Japanese aircraft manufacturers prioritized quality over quantity, carefully handcrafting components to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. American factories embraced mass production with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction. They stamped out parts by the millions. They employed women who 6 months earlier had been operating sewing machines or working as telephone operators, training them in 6 weeks to perform tasks that Japanese craftsmen studied for years. They adopted assembly line techniques pioneered in automobile manufacturing, breaking down the construction of a fighter aircraft into hundreds of discrete operations that could be performed by semi-skilled workers following illustrated instruction cards. The results defied not just Japanese expectations, but the expectations of American planners themselves. When President Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year in 1940, his own military advisors considered the target fantastical. By 1944, American factories were producing 96,000 military aircraft annually. Fighter production alone reached numbers that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. 21,831 aircraft in 1943. 38,873 in 1944. The United States built more fighters in the last 6 months of 1944 than Japan produced during the entire war. But Lieutenant Commander Nishizawa, walking the flight line at Rabaul in January 1943, knows none of these numbers. What he knows is what he sees with his own eyes every time he climbs into combat. Where once he faced small formations of fighters he could dissect with coordinated attacks, he now encounters swarms. Where once he could predict enemy tactics based on observed patterns, he now faces pilots flying with a recklessness that suggests they view their aircraft as expendable. Where once the sight of Zeros emerging from cloud cover sent American formations scattering, he now watches them hold formation and accept combat, absorbing losses with a stoicism that speaks not of courage alone, but of mathematical certainty. They can afford to lose. They know what he is only beginning to suspect. For every fighter he shoots down, 3 more are already loaded on cargo vessels steaming westward from California. The diary entries tell the story more honestly than official combat reports. Lieutenant Toshio Ota, flying from Lae in New Guinea, records in March 1943, "Today we engaged 37 enemy fighters over the Huon Gulf. I personally shot down 2 Airacobras and damaged a 3rd. We lost 4 pilots. 3 weeks ago we had 18 operational Zeros at Lae. Today we have 11. Command informs us that replacement aircraft will arrive within 6 weeks. The Americans we shot down this morning will be flying again by Thursday. The pattern repeats across every operational diary, every unit log, every personal correspondence that survived the war. Japanese pilots rack up impressive individual scores while their overall strength withers. Saburo Sakai shoots down his 60th kill in August 1943 and returns to base to learn that his squadron has been reduced to 8 operational aircraft. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa becomes the Japanese Navy's leading ace, with 87 confirmed victories, and watches his wingmen disappear one by one, replaced by teenagers with 50 hours of training who die on their second or third missions. The mathematics become inescapable. The Japanese are fighting a war of quality against quantity, and quantity is winning through sheer weight of numbers. The Americans call it attrition. The Japanese experience it as something closer to drowning. By mid-1943, the character of the air war has fundamentally changed. Where once Japanese pilots controlled the tempo of engagements, choosing when and where to fight, they now find themselves defending against American raids that arrive with clockwork regularity. The Wildcats and Aerocobras of 1942 give way to Corsairs and Hellcats, aircraft that match or exceed the Zero's performance, while carrying twice the ammunition and armor plate that allows them to absorb damage that would shred a Zero's lightweight airframe. American pilots adopt tactics specifically designed to negate Japanese advantages in maneuverability. They refuse to dogfight. They dive from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, and climb away using superior power-to-weight ratios. If they miss, they don't turn back to re-engage. They simply circle, climb, and dive again, and again, and again. The tactic infuriates Japanese pilots, trained to view combat as an art form requiring grace and precision. American aviators fight like butchers, they complain in letters home, like men swinging hammers at flies. But the hammers keep swinging, and the flies keep dying, and slowly the realization spreads through Japanese fighter squadrons that the Americans are not trying to outfly them, they are trying to outlast them. The Hellcat embodies this philosophy perfectly. When Grumman engineers designed the F-6F, they studied combat reports from the Pacific and built an aircraft optimized not for elegance, but for survivability and ease of manufacture. It has armor behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a massive R-2800 engine that can absorb battle damage that would disable Japanese power plants. It lacks the Zero's legendary maneuverability, but it doesn't need it. The Hellcat excels at the tactics American pilots have perfected: dive, shoot, zoom away, repeat. More importantly, Grumman can produce Hellcats at a rate of 600 per month by late 1943. The aircraft are so numerous that combat units begin using damaged fighters for spare parts rather than repairing them. Pilots who bail out over friendly territory can expect to be flying again within 48 hours in a brand new aircraft that smells of fresh paint and factory-applied lubricants. Japanese pilots shot down over friendly territory often wait months for replacement Zeros. The symbolic weight of this disparity becomes a physical presence in the cockpit. Petty Officer Kinsuke Muto, flying combat air patrol over Truk Lagoon in February 1944, describes in his diary the psychological impact of facing what he calls the American River. "They come in waves," he writes. "You shoot down 3 and 6 more appear. You destroy a formation and another forms in its place. It is like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. You kill and they keep coming. Where are the factories that build these aircraft? Do the Americans sleep? Do their workers eat? How many people does it take to produce so many fighters?" The questions haunt every Japanese pilot who survives long enough to notice the pattern. The answers, had they known them, would have confirmed their worst nightmares. The Willow Run plant employed 42,000 workers at peak production. Boeing Seattle employed 45,000. Grumman Bethpage employed 25,000. North American Aviation's California facility employed 36,000. Across the United States, nearly 2 million workers labored in aircraft plants alone, supported by millions more producing aluminium, rubber, electronics, and weapons systems. The American aviation industry operated on a scale beyond Japanese comprehension, not because Japanese engineers lacked talent or dedication, but because American industrial capacity operated in a different universe of possibility. The United States produced more aluminium in 1944 than all Axis nations combined produced during the entire war. American factories consumed more electricity in a single month than Japan's entire electrical grid could generate in a year. The railroad network that moved components and raw materials across the American continent carried more tonnage weekly than the Japanese merchant marine transported in 6 months. Even the seemingly minor details revealed staggering disparities. American aircraft manufacturers used electric riveters powered by generators the size of Japanese fighter engines. They employed precision machine tools manufactured in quantities greater than the total number of industrial machines operating in all of Japan. They painted aircraft with spray guns fed by compressed air systems that consumed more steel in their construction than went into building a Zero's fuselage. By 1944, the disparity manifests in ways that transcend mere numbers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kaneyoshi Muto, scrambling to intercept a raid on Tinian, finds himself facing what he estimates to be 60 Hellcats, more fighters than his entire air group possessed 3 months earlier. He shoots down 2 in a diving attack and watches both pilots bail out successfully. They wave at him as they descend beneath their parachutes, casual gestures that convey neither fear nor respect. They will be rescued within the hour by American submarines or flying boats specifically tasked with pilot recovery. They will be flying again before Muto completes his after-action report. He knows this. They know he knows. The gesture is not mockery but statement of fact. The Americans can afford to lose pilots because they can replace them faster than Japan can kill them. The aircraft themselves become symbols of this abundance. American fighters arrive in theater covered in factory-fresh paint, their engines perfectly tuned, their radios working properly, their gun sights calibrated to specifications. When Japanese pilots manage to shoot them down and examine the wreckage, they find manufacturers' inspection tags still attached to components, delivery dates stamped on parts that indicate the aircraft left California less than 2 weeks earlier. They find spare parts stored in sealed containers, extra ammunition loaded into magazines, cigarette lighters tucked into cockpit storage pouches. Casual luxuries that speak of production capacity so vast that manufacturers can afford to include non-essential items as morale boosters. Japanese Zeros limp into combat held together with improvised repairs, their engines overdue for overhaul by hundreds of hours, their fabric control surfaces patched with whatever material mechanics can scavenge. Pilots fly with broken radios because replacement units don't exist. They conserve ammunition because resupply ships can't get through American submarine patrols. They nurse damaged aircraft back to base because replacement fighters are 3 months away in Japan, assuming the factories there haven't been destroyed by B-29 raids. The final recognition comes not in a single moment, but as accumulated understanding. By late 1944, the Japanese Navy's elite fighter units have been ground down to cadres of survivors, flying beside replacements who possess perhaps 30 hours of flight training. The great aces, those who survived the grinding attrition of 1943 and early 1944, find themselves protecting novices who can barely perform basic maneuvers. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, now Japan's leading ace with more than 80 confirmed kills, spends more time teaching basic formation flying than engaging in combat. He watches 19-year-olds die on their first mission, their names entering squadron rosters in the morning and vanishing by afternoon. The Americans face these novices with pilots averaging 200 hours of flight time, flying fighters produced by the thousands, supported by logistics networks that deliver spare parts and ammunition with the reliability of mail service. The turning point exists in retrospect as an extended collapse rather than a single decisive battle. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American pilots later call the Rudiment Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation effectively ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft that attacked the American fleet, 243 were shot down. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The exchange rate, more than 8 to 1, reflects not individual pilots' skill, but the accumulated weight of American industrial advantage, manifesting as superior aircraft, superior training time, superior tactics, developed through the luxury of being able to afford losses while studying what worked. Japanese pilots who survived that day describe not the tactics or the combat maneuvers, but the sheer, overwhelming presence of American fighters. The sky was full of them, Warrant Officer Zenji Abe recalls. Wherever you looked, Hellcats. We tried to break through to the carriers and they simply absorbed us. Like ink dropping into water, we disappeared into them. In the final year of the war, the mathematics become obscene. Japan produces 8,263 fighters in 1945 before surrendering in August. The United States produces 21,696 during the same 8-month period. The disparity extends beyond numbers into every aspect of aviation warfare. American pilots train in Florida and Texas on aircraft identical to those they'll fly in combat, accumulating 300 or 400 hours before shipping overseas. Japanese pilots train on obsolete biplanes, transition to worn-out Zeros pulled from operational units, and deploy to combat squadrons with 70 hours of total flight time. American squadrons rotate stateside for rest and refitting every 8 months. Japanese pilots fly until they die. The symbolic object that haunts Japanese pilot memoirs from this period is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but a sound, the constant drone of American engines. In bases from the Philippines to Formosa to the home islands themselves, Japanese personnel live beneath the omnipresent rumble of American bombers and fighters passing overhead, in formations so large they darken the sky. The sound becomes psychological warfare, more effective than propaganda. It is audible proof that American industry has achieved a scale of production that makes Japanese resistance not heroic, but futile. Lieutenant Commander Nishizawa doesn't live to see the surrender. In October 1944, while riding as a passenger in a transport aircraft, he is shot down by American Hellcats over the Philippines. His death receives brief mention in Japanese Navy records. In American records, his transport is listed as one of 12 aircraft destroyed that day in routine sweeps. The kind of mission that involved so little risk it doesn't merit detailed analysis in after-action reports. The war's greatest Japanese ace dies as a statistic in an engagement the Americans barely remembered. The epilogue writes itself in production figures and survivor testimony. When Japanese representatives signed surrender documents aboard USS Missouri in September 1945, American factories are still producing fighters at a rate of 3,000 per month. Production lines that built 70,000 fighters during the war years continue operating because cancelling contracts and retooling for civilian production will take months. The excess aircraft are eventually scrapped, melted down or sold for pennies on the dollar, or pushed off carrier decks into the Pacific because storing them costs more than their material value. The tragedy lies not in the battles themselves, but in the fact that the outcome was determined before the first shot was fired. Japanese pilots fought with skill and courage against an opponent whose victory was ensured not by superior tactics or training, but by industrial capacity so vast it rendered individual heroism irrelevant. American pilots were not better flyers in those early months. They were better supplied. By 1944, they were also better trained, better equipped, and backed by a production system that could absorb catastrophic losses and emerge stronger. The Zero that represented cutting-edge technology in 1941 was obsolete by 1943, not because Japanese engineers failed to design improvements, but because Japanese industry couldn't produce new designs in quantities that mattered, while simultaneously replacing combat losses. The Hellcat and Corsair emerged from design bureaus, backed by factories that could implement improvements mid-production run, that could manufacture 20 different variants simultaneously, that could scrap an entire month's production if testing revealed flaws, and start over without seriously impacting overall supply. Former Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, interviewed decades after the war, summarized the experience with characteristic precision. We were taught that spirit and skill would overcome material disadvantage. We believed it. We proved it in 100 battles. But the Americans had spirit and skill and material advantage, They had factories that worked like heartbeats, constant, tireless, pumping out fighters that filled the sky. You cannot defeat a heartbeat through willpower. We tried, we failed. The mathematics were against us from the first day. The truth, embedded in those production figures, echoes beyond military history. The American industrial achievement during World War II represented more than manufacturing prowess. It embodied a philosophical conviction that abundance, properly organized and directed, could overwhelm any opponent. Where totalitarian systems concentrated production under central command, American industry maintained competitive markets that drove innovation through profit incentive. Where authoritarian regimes controlled labor through coercion, American factories attracted workers through high wages and the appeal of contributing to democratic survival. The system was inefficient in ways that appalled efficiency experts. It was redundant, competitive, sometimes chaotic. It also worked with effectiveness that no centrally planned economy could match. The Japanese aces, who couldn't believe America built fighters faster than they could shoot them down, were witnessing not just industrial capacity, but the manifestation of a different organizing principle. Democracy at war proved capable of mobilizing resources on a scale dictatorships couldn't achieve, precisely because it didn't rely on compulsion. Workers built Hellcats because they were paid well, because they believed in the cause, because the system allowed them to advance based on merit, because victory meant returning to lives they chose freely. The aircraft rolling off those production lines carried with them the accumulated economic power of a system that valued individual initiative and channeled it toward collective purpose. In the end, the mathematics that doomed Japanese naval aviation were not just equations of production versus loss rates. They were calculations of systemic capacity, of what free societies could achieve when threatened, of how abundance rooted in liberty could overwhelm scarcity born of authoritarianism. The zeros fell not because American pilots were better, but because American society was more productive. The aces died not from lack of skill, but from fighting against an industrial system that treated individual aircraft as expendable components in a larger machine of overwhelming power. The drone of American engines that haunted Japanese pilots in those final years was the sound of that machine at work. Tireless, relentless, building fighters faster than courage alone could destroy them. It was the sound of democracy translated into aluminium and aviation fuel, the sound of freedom at war, the sound, ultimately, of mathematical inevitability, grinding skill and spirit into history.